There is a particular kind of suffering that belongs only to the anxious soul. The suffering of hearing nothing from God when you desperately need an answer. It is not simply waiting, it is waiting while the mind spins, the heart trembles, the imagination invents painful possibilities, and fear begins to whisper its lies. The anxious soul does not merely experience silence, it interprets it, and it often interprets it incorrectly. Let me ask you something honestly. Have you ever prayed with urgency, seeking clarity or comfort, and the only response you received was stillness? Did that stillness make you fear that Jesus was ignoring you? Or worse, did it make you wonder whether he was disappointed in you? If so, you have already touched the spiritual tension Saint Faustina knew intimately. Despite her extraordinary encounters with Christ, she also lived through moments when his voice seemed distant and his presence seemed veiled. And she discovered something profound. The anxious soul rarely hears Jesus correctly when he is silent. Not because Jesus is unclear, but because anxiety distorts perception. Faustina learned that when the heart is restless, silence becomes a canvas on which fear paints its own conclusions. The soul assumes rejection where there is only waiting. It imagines displeasure where there is only love. It projects abandonment where there is only hidden guidance. Anxiety does not simply feel silence, it fills it. And this is where the soul begins to suffer unnecessarily. Jesus' silence is never empty, yet the anxious heart treats it as evidence. Evidence that something is wrong. Evidence that prayer is failing. Evidence that God is distant. But silence is not evidence, it is invitation. Faustina realized that Jesus often remained silent, not to punish the anxious soul, but to free it from relying on emotional reassurance. Silence becomes a mirror, revealing how much of our relationship with Christ depends on feeling rather than trust. The anxious soul misreads silence because it expects Jesus to respond quickly when fear rises. But Jesus responds not to fear, he responds to faith. He is not uninterested in our distress. He is trying to lead us beyond it. In her diary, Faustina describes moments when she begged Jesus to speak, only to receive no immediate answer. And in those moments, she learned that the silence of Christ is never cold. It is never indifferent. It is the silence of someone who knows that the heart will grow stronger if it leans into him without guarantees. Silence becomes the training ground of trust. But to the anxious soul, it feels like abandonment. Not because Jesus has withdrawn, but because the soul has not yet learned to distinguish silence from distance. Faustina teaches us that Jesus' quiet is not a withdrawal of love. It is a refining of love. It is the moment when faith leaves childhood and begins to mature. The anxious soul misinterprets silence because it listens to its fears more than to the character of God. And fear always interprets silence in the worst possible way. But Jesus' silence is never a no. It is never a punishment. It is never the disappearance of his presence. It is the beginning of a deeper relationship. There comes a point in every anxious soul's journey where the silence of Jesus stops being merely uncomfortable and begins to feel personal. It becomes charged with meaning, but meaning the soul invents, not meaning Christ intends. The heart begins to whisper interpretations that have nothing to do with God. He is disappointed with me. He is punishing me. He must be tired of my failures. He has nothing to say to me anymore. And suddenly silence becomes a verdict. Let me ask you something quietly. Have you ever felt that Jesus' lack of response confirmed your worst fears about yourself? That maybe you prayed incorrectly, believed insufficiently, or somehow disqualified yourself from hearing him? This is the emotional and spiritual trap the anxious soul falls into. It confuses silence with separation. It confuses delay with displeasure. It confuses hiddenness with rejection. But what the soul feels is not what Jesus is doing. Faustina knew this intimately because she lived through seasons when Christ, who once spoke to her with overwhelming clarity, suddenly became quiet. The shift terrified her. She worried she had offended him, failed him, or misunderstood his desires. Her anxiety created an internal courtroom where she judged herself before God ever did. And that is exactly what anxiety does. It puts the soul on trial in the absence of evidence. Jesus' silence becomes a blank page, and fear rushes to scribble its accusations across it. Anxiety always assumes the worst, because anxiety is rooted in the belief that we must earn God's nearness. Faustina learned, painfully, that when the soul believes it must perform perfectly to deserve God's voice, silence becomes unbearable. Not because God has changed, but because the soul has forgotten who He is. Jesus does not withdraw His tenderness when we are anxious. If anything, His love presses closer. But the anxious soul is often too absorbed in its inner storm to sense it. Faustina began to understand that Jesus' silence is not an absence of communication. It is a different mode of communication. It is the language of trust, the language of surrender, the language of purification. He is not punishing the anxious soul. He is strengthening it. Silence forces the heart to confront the question it avoids. Do I trust His character even when I cannot trace His voice? This is the point at which faith becomes faith. Not feeling, not emotion, not reassurance, but faith. And faith grows best not when Jesus speaks, but when He doesn't. It is in silence that the anxious soul learns to recognize which voice belongs to Christ and which belongs to fear. It is in silence that the soul realizes the accusations it hears are not divine. They are internal. It is in silence that the soul discovers Jesus has not stepped away. He is simply refining the way it listens. Faustina eventually saw that Christ's silence was the moment when her trust was being reshaped. He was not distancing Himself. He was teaching her to stop interpreting Him through the lens of fear. The anxious soul misread silence because it forgets that love can speak without words. Christ's silence is not a judgment. It is a shelter. There is a kind of silence that does not wound the soul but shields it. It does not feel like protection, of course, at least not at first. To the anxious heart, silence feels like a door shutting, like a withdrawal, like a fading warmth. Yet many times the silence of Jesus is not distancing at all. It is mercy taking a quieter form. Let me ask you something sincerely. Have you ever noticed that when you are overwhelmed, frightened, or spiraling internally, you can barely hear anything, not even the voices of those who love you? And sometimes the gentlest thing they can do is stop speaking until you can breathe again. This is how Faustina came to understand Jesus' silence. It was not a sign that He was unmoved by her distress. It was a sign that He refused to speak into a storm that would twist His words into fear. Jesus does not pour living water into a cup that is shaking uncontrollably, not because the cup isn't worthy, but because the water would spill and be lost. When the soul is anxious, unstable, restless, His silence becomes an act of protection. It keeps the heart from misinterpreting His intentions, from weaponizing His words against itself, from turning gentle guidance into internal accusation. Faustina realized this slowly, over many nights, when she begged for a response that did not come. She eventually saw that if Jesus had spoken in those moments, she would have misread Him. His silence was not withholding. It was safeguarding. Silence becomes the pause in which the soul's turbulence can settle. Only then can it receive truth without distorting it. And here lies one of the most misunderstood spiritual realities. The anxious soul believes silence means God has stopped caring. In reality, silence often means God is caring more carefully than ever. Faustina compared this to the way Jesus dealt with His disciples. When they were afraid, panicking, or consumed by misunderstanding, He often spoke fewer words, not more. He waited for calm to return, so His voice could actually heal. This is why Jesus' silence is never cold. It is deliberate, measured, merciful. He knows that anxiety does not need more information. It needs more trust. And trust cannot be taught with explanations. It must be formed in the quiet. The anxious soul keeps asking, "Why won't you speak?" But Jesus is inviting it to ask a deeper question. Why do I believe silence means abandonment? That shift changes everything. Faustina learned that once the soul stops assuming the worst about silence, the heart becomes capable of receiving what Jesus has been trying to give all along, a peace that does not depend on circumstances, emotions, or immediate answers. Silence becomes sanctuary, not punishment, not neglect. Sacred space where fear loses its grip and faith begins to breathe again. And it is exactly in this quiet that Jesus prepares the anxious soul for something it cannot yet imagine, a relationship no longer dictated by fear. There is a moment in the journey of every anxious soul when the real battle emerges, not between God and fear, but between fear and the way the soul perceives God. Jesus may be lovingly near, but the anxious heart reads his nearness as scrutiny. He may be guiding gently, but the anxious heart twists that guidance into pressure. He may be silent with purpose, but the anxious heart assumes silence means danger. This misinterpretation is not a flaw in God's communication. It is a distortion inside the human heart. Let me ask you something with honesty. How many times have you expected God to correct you when you prayed, only to discover later that he had never condemned you at all? How many times did you assume you disappointed him simply because you felt insecure within yourself? The anxious soul does not hear Jesus, it hears its own fears echoing back. Faustina came to understand this deeply. She noticed that Jesus would wait, sometimes longer than she wanted, before speaking to her again. At first she assumed it was punishment, but in time she realized it was something far more tender. Jesus was waiting for her inner storm to calm so she could receive his voice for what it truly was, not for what fear imagined it to be. Christ refuses to compete with fear's narrative. He will not shout over insecurity. He will not force himself into a heart that is busy accusing itself in his name. He waits until the soul can hear him as love, not as threat. This waiting is painful, but it is profoundly merciful. If Jesus spoke while the anxious soul was drowning in fear, his words would be twisted into confirmation of the soul's worst assumptions. He withholds speech so that his voice is not used against the very soul he is trying to heal. Faustina experienced this purification more than once. She described moments when her emotions were in turmoil, and she begged Jesus for clarity. Yet he remained still, not because he was distant, but because he would not let fear shape her understanding of him. Only when her heart quieted, even if just a little, did his words come, gentle and unmistakably full of mercy. Jesus' silence then becomes the doorway to a new understanding of him, an understanding no longer filtered through anxiety's suspicions. The anxious soul believes Jesus is testing it, but in truth, Jesus is allowing the soul to outgrow its fear-based interpretation of his love. Silence resets the spiritual senses. Silence teaches the heart that not every pause is abandonment. Silence reveals that God is not fragile, easily offended, or withholding affection. The moment the soul stops interpreting everything as threat, its entire relationship with Christ transforms. Prayer becomes lighter. Trust becomes possible. The heart becomes receptive instead of defensive. Faustina discovered that once she stopped assuming the worst, Jesus' silence no longer frightened her. It prepared her. It steadied her. It made her capable of receiving him in a deeper, calmer way. And for the first time she understood. Silence was not Jesus pulling away. It was Jesus drawing her into a love that no longer needed constant reassurance. There comes a turning point in the spiritual life, a moment when the anxious soul realizes that Jesus' silence has been doing something quietly, patiently, invisibly within it. The silence that once felt like abandonment begins to feel strangely stabilizing. The quiet that once triggered fear begins to create space for a different kind of awareness. A recognition that perhaps Jesus was not withholding anything after all, but giving the soul room to breathe. The anxious soul, exhausted by its own interpretations, begins to soften, not because circumstances have changed, but because something inside has. Let me ask you something gently. Have you ever noticed that after wrestling with your own thoughts long enough, you eventually become tired of assuming the worst? And in that tiredness, a strange peace begins to seep in, not because you solved anything, but because you finally stopped fighting against silence. This is the moment Faustina saw emerging in her own heart. After days or weeks of feeling spiritually suspended, she suddenly realized she was no longer afraid. The silence had not lifted, yet the fear had. And in that new interior quiet, she began to feel something she had never expected. Jesus' silence was not empty. It was forming her. It was stripping away the layers of anxiety that made her dependent on emotional reassurance. It was removing the reflex that made her interpret every pause as rejection. It was healing the compulsive need to know what God was doing at every moment. In silence, her soul was learning rest for the first time. This is why Jesus uses silence, not to confuse but to reorder the heart. Words can comfort, yes, but silence can transform. Silence brings the soul face to face with its own attachments, its need for control, its fear of making mistakes, its constant search for divine approval, its fragile sense of worth. When Jesus does not speak, the soul is forced to confront these inner structures, and slowly, painfully, beautifully, they begin to dismantle. Faustina discovered that silence unveils what noise hides. It brings clarity, not through explanation but through simplification. When words disappear, the heart can finally distinguish between the voice of fear and the quiet, steady presence of God. She realized that Jesus' silence was not a pause in communication, it was communication. A communication meant to deepen, purify, strengthen, and free. The anxious soul learns slowly and tenderly that Jesus does not need to speak in order to be present. His silence is full of him, full of intention, full of mercy, full of work being done beneath the surface. Work the soul will only understand later. And then something beautiful begins to happen. The soul stops demanding answers. It stops needing constant reassurance. It stops interpreting everything emotionally. It simply becomes available, open, quiet, receptive. For the first time, it rests. Faustina understood this transformation deeply. She realized that the silence she once feared was actually leading her into a version of herself she had never known. A steadier version, a freer version, a more trusting version. Silence had done what words never could. There is a sacred moment, quiet, interior, almost imperceptible, when the anxious soul finally understands what Jesus' silence was meant to teach. It does not come with fireworks or visions. It arrives gently, like dawn. The soul wakes up inside itself and realizes, he was never absent, I was simply afraid. Fear had been speaking louder than reality. Anxiety had been interpreting everything. Silence had been misread as distance. And Jesus, patient beyond comprehension, had been waiting for the soul to grow into a love deep enough to hear him without needing constant signs. Let me ask you something sincerely. Have you ever lived through a season that made no sense while you were in it, but when you looked back later, it became one of the most defining times of your spiritual life? Have you ever realized, only after the storm passed, that Jesus' silence had changed you more profoundly than any words would have? This is exactly what Faustina experienced. There came a moment when her inner agitation faded, when fear loosened its grip, when the noise inside her heart grew quiet enough for something new to emerge. And in that clarity, she finally understood what Jesus had been doing. He was teaching her to trust him without depending on her emotions. He was teaching her to recognize him by faith, not by feeling. He was teaching her that love matures only when it is stripped of its need for constant affirmation. Silence had been the classroom for this transformation. Faustina realized that Jesus' silence had not been an absence. It had been a refining fire, a gentle one, yes, but a fire nonetheless. It burned away the anxious belief that God's love fluctuates. It consumed the fear that he withdraws when we fail. It purified the instinct to measure his affection by our sensations. In the end, silence revealed the truth that anxiety had always obscured. Jesus is faithful even when he is quiet. He is close even when he feels distant. He is working even when he seems still. And once the soul finally sees this, a strange and beautiful freedom rises within it. The soul becomes less reactive, less frightened, less fragile. Prayer becomes simpler, not an attempt to coax God into speaking, but a resting of the heart in his presence. Trust becomes steady, not built on what the soul feels, but on who Jesus is. Love becomes stronger, not because it is constantly comforted, but because it has learned to endure silence without collapsing. The relationship deepens, the fear dissolves, the soul becomes anchored, and Jesus, who waited so patiently for this moment, finally speaks again, not because he had withheld his voice out of anger, but because the soul is now able to hear him truthfully. Faustina discovered that silence had changed the entire landscape of her interior life. What once terrified her now grounded her. What once felt like abandonment now felt like invitation. What once stirred panic now stirred reverence. She realized that Jesus had been saying all along, without words, "Do not interpret me through your fear. Interpret your fear through my love." Once the soul understands that, anxiety loses its power forever.